This is the second part of my comprehensive summary of all wars and conflicts in the Ace Combat series. In the previous video, I went over Strangereal's military history from medieval times up to the year of 1999, and in this episode, I'll cover the historical period from the years of 2000 to 2040. I highly recommend you to watch part 1, link in the description, to understand and be familiar with the geopolitical context of Strangereal as we move on with the timeline. Before we get going, two important corrections from part 1. First, I forgot to mention one conflict, probably the least known war in Strangereal history, the Usean-Balkan War. Not the Ocean War, nor the Cold War, nor the Economic War, nor the Balkan War, nor the Balkan conflict, but a whole new war featuring the most iconic Strangereal duo. Sometime in the late 60s or early 70s, Erusea ended up invading South Balka. The lore doesn't mention who started the conflict or who won it. What we do know is that during the Usean invasion, the parents of our favorite buddy got killed and he became an orphan and later mercenary pilot. If you have never heard about this conflict, you're just like me. I only became aware of it when I saw this comment on the previous video, and this conflict was never mentioned in any Ace Combat game. So you might be wondering then, where does the lore come from? And the answer is the Hasegawa F-15C GOM-2 model kit. Yeah, that's right. Moving on, the second correction revolves around Erusea's borders, which were not drawn correctly on the map. They were wrongly like this, but they should have been like this. I tell ya, Strangereal geography is complicated because of borders. With the corrections out of the way, let's dive into the military history of Strangereal in the 21st century, when the planet is still fresh out of the Ulysses disaster. In the continent of Enia, the country of Slovakia was hit hard by the fragments of Ulysses. The neighboring country of Emeria started to send in aid, but the aid convoys were being regularly plundered by regional factions. I wouldn't classify this as a full-blown conflict yet, but even in the year of 2000, there were already signs of the impending Slovakian Civil War. Another region severely affected by the fall of the asteroids was the continent of Usea, and as a result, we had the 2000 Usean refugee dispute. In essence, this was a humanitarian, diplomatic, and economic dispute between Erusea and the other Usean nations, as Erusea stopped accepting more Ulysses refugees. Being a continental power, other nations expected Erusea to take higher quotas of refugees. However, Erusea was particularly hit hard by Ulysses and thus was unwilling to accept more migrants, so they closed down their borders. As a result, other Usean countries imposed economic sanctions on Erusea and boycotted their products, thus delaying Erusean recovery and raising tensions, which ended up sparking the Usean Continental War. In the summer of 2003, Erusea invaded the neighboring nation of San Salvation and took over control of Stonehenge, the superweapon originally designed to destroy the fragments of the Ulysses asteroid. The Federation of Central Usea issued an ultimatum for Erusea to withdraw, but seeing that Erusea had no plans to back down, a military coalition of Usean countries was formed to resist Erusean aggression. This was the Independent States Allied Forces, or ISAF for short. By modifying Stonehenge to perform aerial suppression attacks, Erusea took control of almost all of the Usean continent and forced the ISAF to withdraw. Then we have the events of Ace Combat 4, where ISAF conducts a counterattack, destroys Stonehenge, liberates the continent from Erusean occupation, and finishes the war by taking the Erusean capital city of Farbanti, and installing an ISAF-backed government in Erusea. Now, technically, this is the end of the Usean Continental War, but we did have an insurrection instigated by young Erusean officers who did not accept the surrender orders and took control of Megalith, the Erusean superweapon capable of launching ICBMs and weaponizing asteroid fragments in the orbit. This insurrection only lasted a week as the ISAF dispatched both air and ground forces to destroy Megalith. By the end of September 2005, ISAF's interim government was established in Erusea. It would work hard to demilitarize the country and put it on a path for a bright and peaceful future. But this is Strangereal, there's no such thing as peace. The ISAF interim government in Erusea proved to be extremely unpopular, as viewed by the current and previous members of the military. As a result, they created an underground organization known as Free Erusea, whose goal was to regain Erusea's independence from the ISAF. In September of 2006, Exactly 1 year after the end of the Continental War, members of Free Erusea were able to seize an abandoned arms factory and launch their uprising against the ISAF forces that occupied the country. This uprising was quickly quelled when the ISAF launched Operation Katina, when they literally sent only one fighter pilot to attack all Free Erusea. This conflict is featured in the arcade mode of Ace Combat 5, where you play as Mobius 1, the same protagonist of Ace Combat 4. After defeating Free Erusea, ISAF was able to tighten their control over Erusea and obtain advanced aeronautical technology after discovering some advanced Erusean UAVs. Free Erusea looked like it was defeated for good, but actually the organization just went dormant for a few years. Let's shift our attention back to Slovakia. As I mentioned previously, since the year of 2000, there were already some regional factions fighting for power, and by the year of 2007, the fighting intensified to a full-blown civil war. There were 5 main factions in the conflict: the Island Coalition, the Independent Terror Federation, the Northern Highlands faction, the Lees United Front, and the Eastern faction. All these factions had been active for some time, absorbing the power vacuum left by the crumbles of the Slovakian government post-Ulysses disaster. As far as the lore goes, this is the only conflict in Strangereal that features a genocide which resulted in the death of over 200,000 people. This happened because the Lees faction diverted aid coming from Emeria away from the civilians in need. The 5 factions fought among themselves for 5 years, bringing total destruction to the country, and ultimately the Eastern faction emerged as the winner thanks to its employment of advanced technology and foreign mercenaries, primarily coming from Belka and North Ossia. As a consequence of the civil war, the Slovakian troops became highly experienced, fielded very advanced technology, notably their aerial fleet, and many in the military harbored strong feelings against the neighboring country of Emeria because their aid was used to finance some factions during the Civil War, even though the Emerian government did not do this on purpose. We now move over to the year of 2010, where we had some major developments in Strangereal. In the month of September, the Western Ocean Air Defense Force zone was penetrated by some unidentified aircraft. As you would expect, the Ocean Air Force intercepted these aircraft on several different occasions until the Union of Yuktobanian Republics declared war against the Ocean Federation by launching a surprise attack. Ace Combat 5 is one of the longest games in the series, but to summarize the lore, suffices to say that both the Yuktobanian and Ocean governments had been victims of a secret coup. Yuktobanian Prime Minister and the Ocean President were removed, and warmonger officials in both governments took their place, with either group believing that they could easily crush their opponents, as Yuktobania had a formidable navy with 2 submarine aircraft carriers, and Osea was in possession of the Arcbird, a weapon capable of shooting lasers from space. Behind the coup was a secret organization known as the Greymen, composed of Balkan industrialists, former members of the military and government, bound by a shared goal of avenging Balkan's defeat during the Balkan War and making money by pitting Osea and Yuktobania against themselves and selling weapons to both sides, of course. The initial Yuktobania onslaught failed, and Osea, instead of just trying to defuse the situation, invaded deep into Yuktobania, almost taking the capital city of Sinigrad. The war would have kept on going, except some Ocean soldiers found out how the Greymen were manipulating both governments and exposed their actions to the public. By late December of 2010, Yuktobania and Osea had signed a peace treaty, and their militaries joined forces to fight against the Greymen, stopping them from carrying out nuclear attacks on civilian targets with the objective of intensifying the hatred between Osea and Yuktobania. The Circum-Pacific War, also known as the Balkan Conflict, was the biggest conflict in Strangereal in terms of land area affected, as it spanned across 2 continents, and it was also featured the largest amount of superweapons: the Senfaxi, the Rimfaxi, the Arcbird, and the Solg. After the war, Osea and Yuktobania continued to have friendly relations. Osea was primarily interested in promoting peace abroad, and subsequently took an active role in building the International Space Elevator in the continent of Usea, believing that its construction would help stabilize the region. Osea did overlook one thing, however. The Greymen were still at large, and they would be making their moves to incite another conflict in the years to come, through their crown jewel, the military giant Grunder Industries, which is ironically based in North Osea. As the construction of the space elevator was taking place, Osea became increasingly influential in the continent of Usea by establishing military presence over there. The ISAF was absorbed into the International Union peacekeeping forces. In the year of 2014, we had another uprising by Free Erusea, because if you don't succeed at first, you try again, basically how Stranger works. This uprising too was short-lived as the IUN peacekeepers defeated the Free Erusian forces in 3 different battles by deploying Mobius 1 once more in the VR mode of Ace Combat 7. It turns out, however, that Free Erusia's actions had only been a diversion, and nobody knows what the ultimate goal was at the time, and needless to say, Free Erusia's leadership remained intact and the organization went dormant for a few years. Let's move away from Usea for now and focus on the continent of Ania. I mentioned previously that the Estovakian Civil War went from 2007 and ended in 2013. However, even with the victory of the Eastern faction and the setup of a military government led by the generals, Estovakia was far from stable. We had assassination attempts on government officials, raids on humanitarian aid depots, and hatred against Emeria continued since they unintentionally financed Estovakia's civil war. In mid-2015, the generals of Estovakia took the opportunity to launch a surprise attack on Emeria for revenge's sake. In Ace Combat 6, you take part in Emeria's large-scale withdrawal to its far western territories, as Estovakia's onslaught with its aerial fleet and Nimbus cruise missiles was seemingly unstoppable. Upon doing its last-stand defense and regrouping, the Emerian military was able to formulate a counterattack and regain its territory by destroying the Estovakian aerial fleet in the process. Unlike other games in the series, Emeria did not get to invade Estovakian soil as they signed a peace treaty after regaining control of their capital, the city of Grace Maria. By that point, the Estovakian military was crumbling down, and even their desperate attempts to destroy civilian targets with weapons of mass destruction had failed. Thus, they were very much willing to sign a peace treaty with Emeria in May of 2016. It's unknown if Emeria continued to provide aid to Estovakia after this war, but we do know that Estovakia remained a war-torn, impoverished nation for the foreseeable future. Speaking of impoverished nations who are known for their civil wars, we have the small country of Leasath, located in the south of the Usean continent. There isn't much lore available on Leasath, but we know its own civil war raged for years to finally end in 2019. Although unconfirmed, it's believed this civil war was actually a product of the Leasathian defense industry as a way to prop up its military sales, because the military members were stakeholders of the Leasathian military-industrial complex. Definitely no conflict of interest there. Consequences of this civil war was the advancement of Leasathian military technology and the acquisition of experience by its troops. It's worth noting that the neighboring country of Aurelia was providing financial aid to Leasath during the civil war, but this aid never really reached the civilians in need and went elsewhere. I hope you're seeing a pattern here on what happens with all these countries that provide aid. We'll talk about the Aurelia-Leasath War very soon. But because of chronological order, we have to return to the continent of Usea. In 2019, the International Space Elevator was nearing completion. By this time, Erusea was ruled by its royal family instead of the provisional ISAF government, and several influential members of the Erusian military, quite possibly members of Free Erusea, were able to convince the Erusian royal family that the construction of the space elevator was only a way of Osea to gain influence and control the region. In the previous years, Erusea had completely modernized its armed forces through the acquisition of several UAVs coming from Grunder Industries, which again was controlled by the Greymen, the Balkan folks that despise Osea. With an enormous arsenal at their disposal, the Erusian military convinced the Erusian princess to declare war on Osea and the International Union peacekeeping forces. Erusea seized the space elevator, the two arsenal birds that protected the space elevator, and simultaneously attacked several Usean and allied military facilities by launching drones from container ships that had been shipped weeks in advance. Thus began the Lighthouse War featured in Ace Combat 7. Instead of just trying to take the space elevator directly, the Usean forces just went around the heavily defended zone to make their way to the Erusean capital city. It's worth pointing out that during the middle of the war, we have the Ace Combat 7 DLC missions where Usean had to chase down a deserting Erusean submarine aircraft carrier under the command of a psychopath captain. But coming back to the main campaign, upon capturing Farbanti, the Erusean capital city, Usean unleashed its brilliant plan of destroying Erusean satellite infrastructure to cripple the remaining Erusean forces remaining in the continent by cutting off their communications. Coincidentally, the Erusean military had the same plan, and as a result, both sides lost GPS and long-distance communications. Despite losing the capital, Erusea did not give up. However, its remaining government and military were divided. Civil war broke loose between the conservative and radical factions of the Erusean military, and taking this as an opportunity, the territories of Voslaj and Shilaj, which were former countries previously annexed by Erusea, tried to regain their independence. In the midst of all this chaos, the Usean forces kept on fighting and were able to retake the space elevator, thus bringing an end to the Lighthouse War. The lore isn't specific on the aftermath of the war or whereas Voslaj or Shilaj were able to regain their independence from Erusea. What we do know is that Yuktobania was able to provide aid, and the Usean government subsequently closed down Grunder Industries for their involvements in the Lighthouse War and their pro-Balkan and anti-Usean track record. But hey, just because we lost Grunder Industries, that doesn't mean we won't have corporations fueling wars for profit. In the year of 2020, the nation of Leasath declared war on their peaceful neighbor of Aurelia, claiming retribution for years of exploitation. The reality was that the leader of Leasath just wanted to continue making more money as he controlled the country's arms industry and was confident that by starting a new war, he would keep on pocketing the dollars. The Aurelian-Leasathian War is unique in the sense that it's the only conflict playable in two different games. Ace Combat XI takes place in the beginning of the war where Aurelia is on the defense. Meanwhile, Ace Combat X takes place on the second half where Aurelia mounts a counterattack. Because this game has different paths the player can choose, the lore isn't set in stone, but Aurelian troops are able to retake their capital city of Griswold. The war didn't end here, however, because Aurelian intelligence discovered that Leasath was developing even more advanced weaponry, including a new fighter jet with optical camouflage. The Aurelian military launched an offensive that destroyed these new weapons before they were mass-produced. Again, because Ace Combat X allows you to pick different paths, there's a good and a bad ending depending on the player choices during the campaign. In the good path, the leader of Leasath gets lynched by enraged Leasathian citizens, possibly dying or at least being arrested. In the bad path, he's able to escape the country. With the corrupt leader of Leasath no longer in power, Leasath and Aurelia sign a peace treaty. Just like in the aftermath of the American-Slovakian War, we expect Leasath to remain a war-torn and impoverished nation in the near future, and is unknown if it continued to receive aid from Aurelia. After the year of 2020, the Strangereal timeline becomes complicated because Ace Combat 3, Electrosphere, isn't your standard video game. Corporations in Strangereal amass so much power that they start to become more powerful than countries themselves, particularly in the continent of Usea. One of these corporations was General Resource Limited. It has been active since at least the year of 2000, and their big thing was maritime shipping. But over the years, their businesses have grown into private military company, making smartphones, internet and telecommunications, media broadcast and publishing, food production, medical care, construction, urban development, banking, heavy industries, and of course, making military hardware for themselves so they could defend their own assets like any respectable Strangereal company. General Resource's main rival was Newcom Incorporated, which had businesses in virtually all the segments General Resource operated in. In order to please these two corporations, the neo-United Nations created UPO, the Universal Peace Enforcement Organization. Realistically, however, UPO was underfunded and would not be able to contain either General Resource or Newcom in the event of an all-out war. Moreover, the leadership of UPO was in the pocket of General Resource. In 2036, the disputes, or I should say competition, between General Resource and Newcom intensified in the economic and media sectors. But then in the year of 2038, armed conflict finally erupted, thus giving birth to the Intercorporate War. This is where Ace Combat becomes tricky to explain, because there are 5 different paths that each player can take, so there's no canon answer as to which of the 4 factions won the war. Yes, I said 4. UPO, General Resource, Newcom, and the 4th one is Ouroboros, which, as you find out in the game, is a terrorist transhumanist / cult organization that infiltrated different organizations and instigated the Intercorporate War just so people would upload their brains to the electrosphere, the equivalent of the internet, so they could leave their physical bodies behind and have their conscience live forever in the cyberspace, thus achieving the last stage of human evolution. Confusing, isn't it? But wait, it gets worse. The Intercorporate War, as you play in the game, is actually just a series of simulations for an artificial intelligence program that operates a fighter jet, so in essence, I can't really say what happens in the real war outside of the simulation other than that the Ouroboros cult leader guy dies in the end, because that's the only thing in common with all the simulation paths. That being said, after the year of 2040, which is when the simulation happens and the AI program is unleashed into the real world, the Strangereal timeline becomes open-ended. That is until the year of 2090. By this time, the population of Strangereal reaches its saturation point that the planet can no longer support more humans. As a result, the governments of the world unite, form a space force, and begin exploring and colonizing space. This is where the Ace Combat series transitions to become the United Galaxy Space Force series, which is a retcon of over 20 video games from Bandai Namco set in space, including games like Galaxian, Starluster, New Space Order, Galaga, and others. Before we finish the overview of the Strangereal timeline, I'd like to address 2 more conflicts. These aren't canon, which is why I left them for here at the end. Between 1999 and 2015, the government of Nordavik, this neutral country that is barely talked about, was involved in several black operations to protect their interests and maintain stability around the world. If you think Belka is shady, just wait until you hear about what Nordavik did. The top-secret Grendel Squadron was active in the Usean Continental War, the Circum-Pacific War, and the American-Eslovakian War. They did some amazing stuff, but Ace Combat Northern Wings isn't considered canon because, according to them, Grendel Squadron also destroyed the Arkbird, which is a very big conflict with Ace Combat 5. The other conflict, which again, it's not canon, is a civil war / coup that happens in the Kingdom of Sapin in the year of 2025. This wasn't even a proper Ace Combat game because it was like a third-person shooter set in Strangereal where you play as a soldier with a bionics arm suit against the evil regime that took power in Sapin, much like in Metal Gear 4 style, but set in Strangereal. Needless to say, this is not canon in the Strangereal timeline because this game never got released. We only had 2 magazine pages about it when it was being tested as a concept by Project Axis back in 2007. This concludes the comprehensive overview of the military history of Strangereal from the official Ace Combat lore. Hope you have enjoyed this video, and I'm looking forward to see the discussion and feedback in the comments. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.